Number 10. Coded diary. Investigation. Some historical mysteries begin with monuments, royal decrees, or lost cities. Others begin with something much smaller and far more intimate. A private diary, written by someone who clearly never expected strangers to read it. That is what makes coded diaries so unnerving. They do not feel like public artifacts. They feel like trespassing into a mind that wanted to leave a message without surrendering control of it. The diary in this case became a mystery, not because it was physically hidden, but because its contents were locked behind a system no one could easily untangle. Page after page appeared to preserve a coherent record, yet the writing resisted easy interpretation. Symbols repeated with suspicious structure. Patterns hinted at language. Names may have been concealed inside substitutions, abbreviations, or personal shorthand. The result was the kind of object that drives both scholars and obsessives into the same trap. The conviction that the truth is there, just one breakthrough away. That possibility is what gives coded diaries such power. A normal journal can tell us what someone saw. A coded one suggests they saw something dangerous enough to hide. Maybe it recorded political secrets. Maybe it preserved forbidden research, private confessions, or evidence of betrayal. Maybe the code was not designed to conceal world-changing information at all, but simply to protect the writer from family, rivals, or authorities. Yet uncertainty itself becomes fuel. Once a diary resists reading, every page begins to look like a vault. And then the investigators arrive. Linguists search for structure. Cryptographers test substitution systems. Historians try to match dates, handwriting, and context. They compare margins, ink, recurring glyphs, damaged passages, and references to known events. Each small success seems to promise a final unraveling, but coded documents often produce a more maddening result. A few words emerge, then a phrase, then a section that almost makes sense, and just as the mystery appears ready to surrender, ambiguity returns and the text slips back into shadow. That tension is what makes the case feel so much larger than a diary. It becomes a contest between the dead author and the living reader. The writer controlled what could be known, and centuries later that control still holds. Even if parts of the code are broken, interpretation remains unstable. Was a phrase literal, symbolic, or intentionally misleading? Was the journal a truthful record, or a performance meant to protect the writer behind layers of distortion? Solving the symbols does not always solve the person. In the end, the coded diary investigation becomes a reminder that archives do not simply preserve information. They preserve silence in carefully shaped forms. A locked journal is not empty. It is crowded with intention. Someone wanted memory to survive, but only under terms they chose. That makes the diary feel less like a document and more like a conversation interrupted across centuries. We can hear the voice pressing against the page. We just cannot yet say with confidence what it wanted us to know. Number 9. Enigmatic sculpture. A lost library mystery does not always involve paper. Sometimes the clue standing closest to the truth is made of stone, bronze, ivory, or wood. An enigmatic sculpture can function like a text without words, preserving symbols, identities, and beliefs in a form that survives long after its meaning is forgotten. That is why certain sculptures unsettle historians so deeply. They look deliberate, they look important, and yet the key needed to read them is gone. The sculpture in this case drew attention because it seemed too specific to be decorative and too strange to be comfortably explained. Its posture, gestures, inscriptions, or surrounding motifs suggested ritual or coded significance. Perhaps it depicted a figure no one could confidently identify. Perhaps it carried markings that echoed lost manuscripts or vanished catalogue references. Perhaps it seemed connected to a collection that had once been documented in fragments, leaving modern scholars with the object but not the interpretive world that gave it meaning. That gap is where the mystery begins. Without context, every visible detail becomes unstable. A crown may indicate royalty, divinity, or theatrical symbolism. A book held in stone might identify a scholar, a saint, a librarian, or a guardian of forbidden knowledge. An animal at the figure's feet might be heraldic, mythological, funerary, or political. The object remains physically present, yet intellectually displaced. It has survived the collapse of its own explanation. What makes such sculptures especially dangerous for historical understanding is that they invite confident storytelling. Once an object is detached from its records, people rush to supply one. Antiquarians assign names too quickly, collectors exaggerate provenance, later generations repeat those labels until speculation hardens into accepted fact. And if the sculpture passed through private hands, wartime seizures, black markets, or damaged archives, then each transfer may have stripped away another layer of reliable evidence. The object remains real, but its biography becomes increasingly fictional. Scholars try to fight that erosion with method. They compare style, material, tool marks, iconography, wear patterns, and archaeological parallels. They study whether the base was altered, whether an inscription was added later, whether the object originally belonged to a larger set. They ask whether it stood in a tomb, a library, a temple, a study, or a collector's cabinet. But every answer seems to create another problem. If the sculpture is authentic, why is its context missing? If the context is reconstructed, how much of that reconstruction rests on guesswork? That is why the enigmatic sculpture belongs in a story about lost knowledge. It represents a form of memory that survived materially but not intellectually. The stone remained, the meaning did not. And that imbalance creates a peculiar kind of haunting. We are used to thinking of time as a force that destroys objects and leaves behind stories. Here, the opposite has happened. The object is still here, staring back at us, while the story that made it intelligible has been reduced to fragments, rumors, and silence. In that sense, the sculpture becomes a monument not just to the culture that created it, but to everything that culture lost. It is a relic of a vanished archive, a surviving witness whose language we no longer fully speak. And that may be the most unsettling possibility of all. Not that the object is hiding a secret from us, but that history once knew exactly what it meant, and then forgot. Number 8. Lost painting recovery. Some missing works of art are mourned because they were beautiful. Others are hunted because they may contain evidence, identity, or history that someone once had reason to remove. That is what makes the recovery of a lost painting so compelling in a story about hidden archives. A painting can hang in plain sight for centuries and still remain effectively lost if no one understands what it is, where it came from, or why it disappeared from the record in the first place. The painting in this case became a mystery because it seemed to surface from a gap that should not have existed. Perhaps an old inventory described it, then later catalogues stopped mentioning it. Perhaps wartime movements, estate dispersals, or private sales broke the chain of ownership until the object slipped into obscurity. Perhaps it was misattributed, overpainted, renamed, or stored away under the assumption that it was a copy rather than an original. However it vanished, the result was the same. A work tied to memory had survived without securely surviving in history. That is where recovery becomes more than simple rediscovery. To recover a lost painting is not just to find canvas and pigment, it is to rebuild a broken biography. Investigators begin tracing signatures, restorations, inventories, auction notes, family papers, customs records, and old photographs. Conservators examine the paint layers for alterations. Historians compare style and subject matter against known workshops, patrons, and periods. And as each fragment falls into place, the painting begins to re-enter the world, not only as an image but as testimony. What often makes these cases so tense is the possibility that disappearance was not accidental. Paintings vanish for reasons. They can be looted in war, hidden during political upheaval, sold under pressure, or concealed because their ownership exposes uncomfortable truths. A portrait may reveal a lineage someone wanted buried. A symbolic scene may connect a collector to forbidden networks of belief, money, or influence. Even the frame, inscriptions, or backing materials can preserve traces of movement through confiscation, exile, and theft. Suddenly, the painting is no longer just art. It is evidence wearing varnish. And yet recovery does not always resolve the mystery. Sometimes it deepens it. A recovered painting may prove authentic, but raise new questions about why it disappeared precisely when it did. It may confirm a name while throwing an entire collection's history into doubt. It may expose restoration choices that changed its meaning or reveal that a once familiar image contains hidden layers beneath the visible surface. X-rays, infrared analysis, and conservation reports can turn a reunion into an excavation. The returned object is not necessarily the same object history thought it had lost. That instability is what gives the case its power. The recovered painting becomes a confrontation with the fragility of cultural memory. Entire chapters of the past can depend on whether one object was protected, mislabeled, stolen, or ignored. The archive, in that sense, extends beyond shelves and manuscripts. It includes walls, estates, vaults, trunks, wartime convoys, and forgotten storerooms. A painting that disappears is not just absent from a room. It is absent from the narrative structures that help a civilization remember itself. So when a lost painting finally returns, the moment should feel triumphant. And sometimes it does. But there is usually something darker in the victory. Recovery proves that the object survived. It also proves that history allowed it to vanish long enough to become a mystery. That means someone failed to protect it, someone profited from its disappearance, or someone deliberately helped erase the path back to it. The canvas comes home. The full truth often does not. Number 7. Mystery of the vanished scholar. There are missing people in history, and then there are missing minds. A vanished scholar is unsettling in a different way because scholars do not simply leave behind possessions. They leave annotations, correspondence, drafts, catalogues, rivalries, citations, unfinished arguments, and traces of ideas moving through other people's work. When someone like that disappears too completely, the silence itself begins to feel unnatural. It is not just a missing body, it is a rupture in the chain of thought. The scholar in this case became mysterious because the record around them seemed far too thin for someone who should have been visible. Perhaps they were known to have handled rare texts, decoded fragments, or pursued a controversial line of inquiry. Perhaps later researchers referred to their notes, but those notes could no longer be found. Perhaps a few letters survived mentioning discoveries that were never published. The outline remained, but the center had dropped away. We could see the absence clearly enough to know it mattered. That is what makes the disappearance so powerful inside a lost library narrative. Scholars are often custodians of transition. They move information from fragile objects into durable knowledge. If one vanishes at the wrong moment, entire bodies of understanding can vanish with them. A translation not copied, a catalogue never completed, a warning not circulated, a manuscript borrowed and never returned. The missing scholar becomes a human bottleneck through which history may have tried to pass and failed. Naturally, explanations multiply. Maybe the scholar died suddenly before finishing the work. Maybe war, censorship, exile, or illness scattered the papers. Maybe professional enemies suppressed the findings. Maybe the scholar was discredited, forgotten, or intentionally written out of the story by institutions eager to promote cleaner narratives. Or perhaps something more personal happened. Obsession, paranoia, private debt, political danger, forbidden affiliations, or fear of persecution can drive even brilliant people into concealment. The more incomplete the archive, the more every possibility feels plausible. Investigators in such cases often end up studying the edges rather than the center. They read the correspondence of students, patrons, rivals, and librarians. They track references in footnotes and marginalia. They compare handwriting in unsigned notes. They search estate sales, monastery inventories, university ledgers, shipping manifests, and probate records. Sometimes what emerges is not one dramatic disappearance, but a slow historical evaporation. The scholar did not vanish in a single night. The scholar vanished one lost box, one uncatalogued folder, one forgotten reference at a time. But that gradual explanation is not always comforting. In some ways it is worse. A dramatic disappearance suggests an event. A slow disappearance suggests neglect built into the structure of memory itself. It means a person may have stood at the edge of revelation, only to be erased, not by conspiracy alone, but by institutional indifference, fragmented custody, and time's talent for finishing what censorship begins. A mind can disappear just as thoroughly as a city if no one preserves the map back to it. That is why the mystery of the vanished scholar carries such haunting force. We do not just wonder what happened to the person, we wonder what happened to the knowledge that person carried at the moment of disappearance. Were they on the verge of proving something? Did they misread the past and vanish into a dead end? Did they uncover a truth too inconvenient to circulate safely? Or did history simply fail them so completely that later generations could not distinguish between suppression and forgetting? In the end, the vanished scholar becomes a symbol of lost continuity. Books may survive without being understood. Artifacts may survive without context. But when a scholar disappears, interpretation itself is damaged. The one who might have connected the pieces is gone, and the archive is left full of unanswered gestures pointing toward a mind no longer there to complete the sentence. Number 6. Antique forgery. Not every mystery in a lost archive begins with something genuine. Some begin with something false that is so skillfully made, so perfectly timed, and so desperately wanted that it enters history disguised as truth. That is what makes antique forgery so dangerous. A forged relic does not merely deceive one collector or one institution. It can contaminate scholarship itself, slipping into catalogues, arguments, exhibitions, and national narratives before anyone realizes that the object has been lying from the beginning. The forged artifact in this case became powerful because it seemed to fill a gap too neatly. Perhaps it appeared to confirm a missing chapter in a dynasty, a religious tradition, or a forgotten literary chain. Perhaps it was presented as the long-lost companion to a genuine manuscript, or as an object rescued from the ruins of a vanished collection. Its materials, style, and supposed provenance may have looked convincing enough to satisfy early experts, especially if the discovery arrived at a moment when scholars were eager for exactly this kind of evidence. That is often how the most successful forgeries work. They do not invent random fantasies. They impersonate historical desire. Once accepted, the forgery begins doing real damage. Researchers cite it, curators display it, journalists popularize it, entire interpretations start leaning on its authority. A false inscription can shift a date by centuries. A fabricated seal can connect families, rulers, or religious communities that were never actually linked. A forged map can send investigators searching in the wrong place for generations. Even after exposure, the object continues to poison the record because traces of its influence survive in footnotes, textbooks, and inherited assumptions. The lie enters the bloodstream of scholarship and refuses to leave cleanly. What makes antique forgery especially unnerving is that its creator often understands history very well. A careless fake can be dismissed. A masterful one is built by someone who knows exactly which pigments to mimic, which cracks to imitate, which letterforms belong to which century, and which gaps in the archive are vulnerable to exploitation. The forger studies authenticity in order to counterfeit not just an object, but the emotional experience of discovery. Scholars are not only fooled by the thing itself, they are fooled by the story it seems to complete. And that is where the investigation turns darker. Experts begin re-examining provenance, custody, restoration records, and chemical composition. They look for anachronistic tools, modern contaminants, suspiciously convenient ownership histories, or stylistic details that borrow too heavily from published scholarship. Sometimes the exposure comes through laboratory testing. Sometimes it comes through paperwork. And sometimes it comes through intuition, when an object feels less like a survivor of history than a performance assembled from what history expects to see. But even then, certainty can be hard to recover. If the fake was built from fragments of real antiquity, the truth may be mixed with deception so intimately that separation becomes its own puzzle. That ambiguity is part of the horror. Forgery does not always erase history by destroying it. Sometimes it erases history by replacing it with something more seductive. A civilization can lose the truth not only because records vanish, but because false records arrive and are welcomed too eagerly. The forged artifact becomes a parasite on memory, feeding on the authority of archives while quietly rewriting them from within. In the end, antique forgery belongs in any story about hidden knowledge because it forces an uncomfortable realization. We often fear that the past has been lost, but sometimes the greater danger is that the past has been edited. A forged relic can survive longer than the truth it displaced, and once that happens, historians are no longer just searching for what is missing. They are fighting to recognize what should never have been there at all. Number 5. Hidden map puzzle. Some objects promise knowledge the moment you look at them. A hidden map is one of the most dangerous. It suggests direction, destination, and design. It whispers that the unknown is not random, that someone understood the terrain before us, and that the path to what was lost may still exist if we can read it correctly. That is why map puzzles become so addictive. They do not simply preserve mystery, they make mystery feel solvable. The map in this case drew attention because it looked as though it concealed more than it revealed. Perhaps it contained strange symbols in the margins, routes that did not match known geography, or markings layered over an older design. Perhaps folds, stains, or later annotations hinted that it had been handled by multiple generations, each adding another fragment of meaning. It may have pointed toward a library, a tomb, a chamber, a cache of manuscripts, or an estate long erased from the landscape. Whatever the destination, the real power of the map lay in the sense that it was not merely depicting a place, it was guarding access to one. That is where the puzzle begins. Old maps are never just technical documents, they are arguments about space, authority, and importance. A missing road may be ignorance or intention. A distorted river may reflect bad surveying or deliberate concealment. A decorative symbol may be ornamental, political, religious, or functional. Once investigators suspect the map contains a code, every detail becomes unstable. The scale may hide a numerical key. The compass rose may indicate something other than north. Place names may refer to vanished landmarks or aliases known only within a closed circle of owners, smugglers, monks, scholars, or conspirators. Naturally, teams begin trying to decode it. Historians compare the terrain with old boundaries. Archaeologists overlay it against ruins and cadastral records. Cryptographers test whether distances correspond to letters, dates, or celestial alignments. Cartographic experts examine whether layers were added at different times, whether ink changes suggest revisions, or whether erased sections once held the real clue. And as often happens in these cases, progress arrives in fragments. One symbol suddenly makes sense. A route aligns with an old river course. A name in a ledger matches a forgotten estate. For a moment, the map seems to open. But maps can mislead even when they are genuine. That may be their cruelest feature. A hidden map puzzle does not have to be forged to be dangerous. It only has to be incomplete. Landscapes change, roads vanish, buildings collapse, rivers are diverted, place names shift or disappear. What was obvious to the original owner becomes almost unreadable centuries later. So even if the map once guided someone precisely, modern investigators may be chasing a ghost geography, trying to walk through a world that no longer exists in the same form. And then there is the deeper possibility that the map was never meant to be solved by outsiders at all. It may have been a private mnemonic, a loyalty test, a ritual diagram, or a deliberately partial guide requiring oral knowledge now lost. In that case, the puzzle is not broken because we are missing one clever insight. It is broken because we are missing the community that made the symbols intelligible. The document survives, but the mental world required to use it has vanished. That is why the hidden map puzzle feels so perfectly suited to the mythology of lost archives. A map should lead somewhere. When it does not, the failure feels personal. We begin to sense that the destination might still exist, just beyond the reach of our understanding. Somewhere there may be a sealed room, a buried collection, a forgotten chamber of records, or nothing at all except the proof that people once hid knowledge with extraordinary care. In the end, the map becomes more than a guide. It becomes a mirror of historical longing. We want to believe the past left us a route back to itself. We want to believe enough symbols, enough patience, enough intelligence can restore what time concealed. But some maps survive only to remind us that knowing there was once a path is not the same as being able to walk it. Number 4, secret society, ledger. Some mysteries survive because people forgot to record the truth. Others survive because the truth was recorded, but only for those never meant to be questioned about it. That is what makes a secret society ledger so disturbing. A ledger sounds practical, almost dull. It suggests numbers, names, dues, inventories, and transactions. But once tied to a hidden network, even the most ordinary bookkeeping can become explosive. Lists of payments become proof of loyalty. Initials become identities. Marginal notes become evidence of ritual, bribery, influence, or silence purchased at exactly the right moment. The ledger in this case became mysterious because it appeared to document an organization that history could only partly see. Perhaps the society was rumored in court records, whispered about in correspondence, or mentioned by enemies who may have exaggerated its power. Then a ledger surfaced that seemed to offer something far more dangerous than rumor: internal structure. Entries hinted at meetings, contributions, coded disbursements, and names disguised behind abbreviations, symbols, or aliases. It looked less like mythology and more like administration. And that is precisely what made it threatening. Secret organizations often become larger in the imagination than they were in reality. But a ledger changes the scale of the problem. It suggests continuity. It suggests rules. It suggests that hidden loyalties were sustained over time with enough discipline to keep records. If the names in the book were real, then the society was not merely a tale told by frightened outsiders. It was a functioning system with members, obligations, and probably objectives. Suddenly, historians are no longer asking whether such a group existed. They are asking who it touched, what it funded, and how far its influence reached into courts, churches, universities, mercantile houses, or governments. That is where interpretation becomes dangerous. A symbol next to a payment may indicate rank, initiation, punishment, or nothing more dramatic than accounting style. A recurring date might mark a feast day, a clandestine gathering, or an entirely innocent financial cycle. A list of materials could represent ritual objects, printing supplies, or goods stored for unrelated reasons. Because secrecy distorts context, every detail is vulnerable to overreading. The same ambiguity that protects the society also tempts investigators into building grand narratives out of incomplete evidence. Even so, scholars and archivists keep pushing. They compare handwriting across entries, analyze paper and ink, trace ownership history, and match initials against known families, patrons, clerics, and political actors. They test whether names align with suspicious appointments, sudden wealth, unexplained travel, or overlapping circles of influence. Sometimes a few identifications begin to hold. A merchant appears where he should not. A scholar linked to banned texts turns up in the margin. A donor known publicly for piety appears tied privately to something more shadowed. The ledger starts behaving like a map of double lives. But as often happens with documents born in secrecy, the closer investigators get, the less clean the truth becomes. The book may be incomplete, pages may be missing, some entries may have been added later. Enemies might have forged sections to incriminate rivals, or members themselves may have written in code so dense that even a fully authentic ledger never intended to communicate plainly. What survives may be enough to reveal the existence of the hidden circle, but not enough to define its full purpose. That incompleteness keeps the document balanced between revelation and hallucination. In the end, the secret society ledger matters because it transforms abstraction into administration. Hidden power becomes visible not through confession, but through routine record-keeping. The society stops looking like legend and starts looking like an institution, and that is what makes the ledger so chilling. Great conspiracies in history often feel unreal until a page appears showing who paid, who received, and who was expected to remain silent afterward. Number 3. Codex deciphering. There are few things more seductive in historical mystery than a codex that can be seen, touched, and studied, yet still refuses to yield its meaning. A sealed tomb can remain unopened, a lost city can remain buried. But an unread codex does something stranger. It sits directly in front of us and withholds understanding anyway. It becomes a visible wall between the modern mind and an earlier intelligence that clearly intended to communicate something important. The codex in this case became legendary because it seemed too structured to be meaningless and too resistant to be simple. Its script may have been unknown, its illustration symbolic, its grammar elusive, or its content fragmented by damage and time. Scholars could tell that it was organized, sections repeated, images corresponded to textual blocks, certain characters clustered in recognizable patterns. It had the shape of coherence, and that shape was enough to provoke generations of attempts at decipherment, each driven by the hope that one correct insight could turn silence into speech. What gives such cases their enduring force is that a codex carries the authority of intention. Someone made choices here. Someone selected materials, arranged sequences, repeated signs, and preserved order for a reason. Unlike an isolated inscription, a codex suggests sustained thought. It may contain theology, astronomy, medicine, ritual, law, dynastic memory, alchemy, geography, or a genre no modern category captures cleanly. That possibility is intoxicating because the unread book always seems on the verge of changing more than one small fact. It seems capable of reopening an entire worldview. And that is why decipherment becomes almost obsessive. Linguists search for frequency patterns, grammatical structure, and repeated clusters that might reveal names, particles, or formulaic phrases. Historians study illustrations for clues about cosmology, plants, architecture, stars, sacred symbols, or regional styles. Material specialists examine parchment, pigments, binding, and corrections to determine where and when the codex was made. Cryptanalysts ask whether the system is a natural language, an artificial one, a cipher, or some hybrid that blurs those boundaries. Every discipline circles the book from its own angle, hoping to discover the weak point in the mystery. Sometimes progress comes, but never cleanly. A probable place name may emerge, a handful of characters may be tentatively assigned phonetic values. An image may align with a known tradition. A section may appear to describe plants, calendrical cycles, or devotional practices. Yet each advance tends to create two new uncertainties. If the script is partly phonetic, why do some repetitions behave like codes? If the images are medical, why are the symbols so cosmological? If the codex belongs to a known culture, why does it resist that culture's usual textual conventions? The book seems to respond by shifting its shape every time someone thinks they have grasped it. That instability leads to a dangerous divide. Serious scholarship proceeds cautiously, building arguments from patterns and evidence. But beyond it grows a shadow world of grand claims. Every unread codex attracts people convinced it contains prophecy, lost science, forbidden rites, extraterrestrial contact, or proof that accepted history is a fraud. The less readable the book, the more myth it absorbs. And in that sense, the codex becomes doubly lost, first in its original unreadability, and then in the noise of interpretations imposed upon it. Still, decipherment remains one of history's noblest acts because it is fundamentally an effort to restore relationship. To decode a codex is not merely to crack a puzzle. It is to let the dead speak again in something close to their own order. That is why the stakes feel so high. If the codex opens, a buried system of thought may re-enter the human conversation. If it remains closed, then an entire structure of memory continues to exist only as form without voice. In the end, codex deciphering belongs near the top of any list about lost knowledge because it captures the central terror of the archive. Preservation is not enough. A book can survive fire, water, theft, neglect, and centuries of darkness only to confront us with a harsher truth. Something can remain physically present in history and still be functionally lost. Number 2. Forgotten Pharaoh Tomb. Some archives are built of wood, ink, and stone shelves. Others are sealed in darkness beneath the earth, protected not by librarians but by burial, ritual, and fear. That is what makes a forgotten pharaoh tomb feel so powerful in a story about lost knowledge. A royal tomb is never just a grave. It is a curated chamber of identity, legitimacy, theology, and memory. If such a place is lost, then an entire official version of a ruler's existence can disappear with it. The tomb in this case became mysterious because history seemed to preserve traces of a king without preserving the place that should have anchored his memory. Perhaps inscriptions mentioned a reign too briefly. Perhaps king lists were damaged, altered, or politically selective. Perhaps objects surfaced on the art market or in older excavations that seemed to point toward a royal burial no one could securely locate. The result was the kind of historical tension that grips both scholars and the public alike. Enough evidence to suggest a lost center, but not enough to find it with confidence. That uncertainty matters because pharaonic Egypt was a civilization obsessed with continuity. Royal names, titles, lineages, monuments, and mortuary programs were designed to resist oblivion. When a pharaoh's tomb vanishes from the historical landscape, it raises an immediate and uncomfortable question. Was it lost by accident, or was it pushed out of memory on purpose? Tomb robbery, flooding, erosion, quarrying, and later construction can erase even magnificent spaces. But so can political hostility. A ruler who became inconvenient could be minimized, overwritten, or allowed to disappear more completely than the official ideology was ever meant to permit. That is why forgotten tomb cases quickly expand beyond archaeology into power. Every fragment becomes charged. A cartouche on a broken object may suggest one dynasty or a disputed succession. A funerary style may place the burial in a narrow political window. A reused stone block may prove that later builders dismantled part of the original complex. Even the absence of expected inscriptions can become meaningful. Silence in Egypt is rarely empty. It often indicates conflict, revision, or deliberate compression of the past into something more acceptable to later regimes. Investigators approach such mysteries like reconstructing a shattered text. They compare necropolis geography, burial architecture, reused relief blocks, seal impressions, funerary goods, administrative records, and traces of looting. They study whether the ruler's memory was absorbed into another monument, whether the tomb lies unfinished, hidden, misidentified, or destroyed beyond obvious recognition. Remote sensing, old excavation diaries, satellite imagery, and overlooked spoil heaps may all become part of the search. In some cases, the tomb is not entirely missing. It is simply buried beneath assumptions, catalogued under the wrong identity, or scattered across museums and storage rooms in pieces no one had fully connected before. But even if such a tomb were found, the discovery would not automatically settle the mystery. A royal burial can answer one question while opening 10 more. Was the ruler buried there in full honor or under political compromise? Was the tomb intact, robbed in antiquity, or stripped by later authorities? Do the inscriptions preserve a stable official story, or do they show signs of erasure and rewriting? In Egypt, memory was engineered with extraordinary care. A tomb is not just evidence, it is argument. And arguments made for eternity can still contain evasions. That is why the forgotten pharaoh tomb feels like more than an archaeological prize. It represents the possibility that an entire chapter of state-controlled memory slipped out of the system that was designed to preserve it forever. Somewhere beneath sand, rubble, and centuries of disturbance may lie not merely a burial chamber, but a missing statement about kingship, succession, divine order, and the lengths to which power will go to survive its own contradictions. Number 1. Ancient manuscript theft. Some losses happen through disaster. Fire sweeps through shelves. Floodwater dissolves records. Insects, mold, neglect, and war perform their slow work of erasure. But theft feels different. Theft introduces intention. It means someone looked directly at a surviving fragment of the past, understood that it had value, and chose to remove it from the world where others might study it. That is why ancient manuscript theft belongs at number 1. It is not only a mystery of disappearance, it is a crime against memory itself. The manuscript in this case became legendary because it was known to exist, known to matter, and then known only through absence. Perhaps an old catalogue described it in enough detail to make scholars desperate. Perhaps excerpts had been copied before the original vanished. Perhaps witnesses mentioned its script, illuminations, or contents in tones suggesting unusual significance. A theological text, a dynastic record, a banned commentary, a scientific treatise, a local chronicle, a private correspondence between powerful figures. Whatever it contained, its loss became unbearable precisely because it had once been close enough to touch. That proximity is what makes manuscript theft so haunting. We are not dealing with a text that never survived. We are dealing with one that did survive, passed through real hands, occupied a real shelf, entered a real inventory, and then crossed into shadow because someone carried it away. Once that happens, the archive changes character. It is no longer only vulnerable to time, it is vulnerable to appetite. Collectors, smugglers, ideologues, rival institutions, private heirs, and opportunists all become possible actors in the life or death of knowledge. And manuscripts are uniquely fragile targets because they can be stolen in multiple ways. A whole codex can disappear, but so can individual leaves, illuminations, bindings, ownership pages, marginalia, or seals. One thief may take the book for money. Another may remove a page because one image or passage is more marketable than the intact object. A library may not even realize the full scale of the crime immediately if the volume is misshelved, miscatalogued, substituted, or quietly broken apart over time. By the time scholars understand what has happened, the object may already exist only as fragments scattered across private collections and false provenance stories. That is where the investigation becomes almost unbearable in its implications. Every trace matters: old shelf marks, auction catalogues, estate inventories, wormholes in detached pages, notes in restoration files, smudges from erased ownership stamps, a photograph taken decades earlier in a reading room, a scholar's transcription of a passage no longer accessible. Researchers begin reconstructing not just a text, but a disappearance. They ask who had access, when security changed, which dealers handled similar material, whether wartime chaos provided cover, and how many times the object may have changed identity to survive in illegal circulation. What makes these cases so devastating is that theft often distorts meaning even if recovery becomes possible. A stolen manuscript may return incomplete, pages may be missing. The binding may be modern, Notes proving its provenance may have been scraped away. Entire sections may survive only in black and white photographs or outdated descriptions. The object can come back physically altered by the very process that kept it alive outside the archive. Recovery, in such cases, feels less like restoration than rescue after mutilation. And yet manuscript theft continues because old books carry more than academic value. They carry prestige, ownership, exclusivity, even ideological power. To possess what others cannot see has always tempted certain kinds of people. That temptation is deadly for archives because it turns memory into private property. A civilization's record becomes a commodity, a trophy, a hidden asset locked away from the very public whose history it belongs to. That is why ancient manuscript theft stands at number one. It captures the darkest truth running beneath every lost library mystery on this list. Knowledge does not only vanish because the world is careless. Sometimes it vanishes because someone wanted control over who could know. And once that happens, the missing manuscript becomes more than a stolen object. It becomes proof that history can be looted not only for wealth, but for silence.